Hi, I'm Knut, this is Nerd Film Company, and welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Videography. In this series we aim at helping out anyone starting with videography. And today's episode is about camera settings, the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed. So let's start with the ISO. Looking at these two examples, it's clear to see that you would prefer to have the ISO as low as possible, as close to your base ISO as possible. The ISO 1000 is much less noisy than ISO 10,000. You would also get a higher dynamic range in your footage, and you will also get better color rendition. You can clearly see on these two clips side by side that there's a big difference between the ISO 1000 and ISO 10,000. I raised my ISO from 1000 to 10,000, thus making the whole image a lot more brighter. To compensate for this, I had to close down my aperture to get my exposure to the same level. And that leads us into the next part, which is the aperture. What's the effects of our aperture? The aperture is the aperture blades inside your lens, and the aperture determines how much light gets passed through into your sensor. So they either open up or they close down. So when you open up, you get more light in, and you also get shallower depth of field. When you close it, you get less light in and you get more depth of field. Now, what does depth of field mean? Well, it's quite simple. It says itself. It's more of what you see is in focus. So let's say on both settings, my eye is in focus at 2.8 aperture, wide open. My eye is going to be in focus, and what's in my shelf is not going to be so much in focus. It's going to be more blurry. Now if I stop down and close my aperture, my eye's still gonna be sharp because the focus is on my eye, but the shelf behind me is gonna be more in focus than if it was at 2.8. So let's bring this into practice, and I'll do a few recordings and you'll see for yourself the effect that it has by stopping down or opening up the aperture. Now, if you focus on just the depth of field, there's many factors to determine how much out of focus you can get the background. So if I move closer to the lens, the background will be more out of focus because the ratio between me, the lens and the background changes. So when I get closer to the lens, me and the background gets further away, me and the lens gets closer. Hence, the background gets more out of focus. And this is a theory that's quite similar to both the theory of light and the theory of sound, which we will dive into later. If I move closer to the lens, or if you zoom in with your lens or use a higher focal length on your lens, you will get shallower depth of field, especially if I go to ISO 1000 and f2.8. So let's do all of this. So here I am at ISO 10,000 f9. Here I am at ISO 1000 f2.8. You can see that the shelf is quite out of focus, but if I move closer, it's going to be more out of focus. And that's a sight for sore eyes. I apologize, but it's how I get the message through. So I hope you learned something from this, and I'll see you in the next one. We talked about the ISO and we talked about the aperture. So let's talk about the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is basically how long you expose your sensor to light. So the more you expose your sensor to light, the more light you get there, and the higher the exposure becomes. The less you expose it, the less light you gather and the darker the image will be. But also the less you expose your sensor to light, you expose it for a shorter amount of time and you will freeze the moment of action much more. And in video you will have a certain amount of frames per second to play off to show a motion. And what you want to achieve is some blur to each of those frames so the motion looks more fluent. Now it's up to you and your creative process to determine what kind of shutter speed you want and how much blur you want. It all depends on what kind of action you're recording, what kind of scenario you are in, and if you're recording talking to camera or if you're recording for slow motion. But there is a guideline, and that is the 180-degree rule. What that basically means is, if I'm now recording at 25 frames per second, my shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. So you're doubling the amount of shutter speed compared to the frame rate. So if I was shooting slow motion, I would shoot at 100 frames per second, and then my shutter speed should be 1/200th of a second. So this is a nice rule to get enough motion blur, depending on what you're shooting, but it is up to you to decide if you need less or if you need more. Sometimes you end up in situations where you can only record once, and the footage that you're recording will also be used in slow motion and for talking to camera. And you would want to play that back in 25 frames per second in your post-production, in your final video. What you can do is record in 50 frames per second, but set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. So your shutter speed is set to talking to camera to get a nice motion blur for each frame that you're gonna use when the person or whoever is talking to the camera. But also you have enough frames with a little bit more motion blur to them than what you would normally have if you're gonna slow it down to slow motion, rather than using other techniques to get some slow motion footage from recording in only 25 frames per second. So this is a technique that you can use when you know you're gonna record only once and you need to use both slow motion and talking to camera of the same footage. So how I use the shutter speed is quite basic. I try to stick to the 180-degree rule, but I also deviate if I feel like that is needed. So you have to evaluate the situation and think, is it worth sacrificing a bit on the shutter speed, get more motion or less motion blur to my frames, so I can get rid of other things that is more annoying. For example, if you have banding coming from flickering lights, you could always tweak your shutter speed to get rid of that. Also, if you have any fast-paced movement and you're doing slow motion, instead of that logo or that text on what you're recording gets too blurry because you're following the 180-degree rule, you can always crank up the shutter speed and freeze more of the frames so it is readable. So there's always small issues, but I try to stick to the 180-degree rule, which is basically a guideline and a very good one. It's a reason why it exists, and then you can always deviate a little bit. You can always go down a tiny bit on the shutter if you need to compensate with getting rid of some noise and lowering your ISO so it compensates for the ISO being lowered. Follow the rule and then make your own decisions, and also remember, it is your art, it is your choice. And if you want, for example, to create a scene where someone feels dizzy, you can lower the shutter speed underneath your frame rate and you will get more dragged out motion, which seems like someone is not feeling right. So there is a lot of creative stuff that can be made with alternating your shutter speed. So that's it for now, and thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.